Hello, and welcome back to Wired for Change, where we explore the people, technologies, and ideas reshaping our world. I'm your host, Amy Yee. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Sergio Marchi. Sergio joined us previously to talk about his book, Pursuing a Public Life, and the lessons learned from his remarkable career, arriving as a child of immigrants and then blossoming into something of a troublemaker, I believe, as a young man, and then eventually holding many incredible roles, including Canada's Minister of International Trade, Canada's ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, and the president and CEO of the Canadian Electricity Association. Today, we're going to build on that conversation by exploring something that runs through many of these experiences: the power of bringing people together, and how proximity, trust, and sustained interaction can sometimes accelerate real change in a way that institutions alone often can't. Sergio, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back, and thanks for having me again and putting up with me again.
Here's that troublemaker again.
It didn't stop at my youth, huh?
Oh, no, not from the stories I've read in the book, Sergio.
I'm a lost cause.
So speaking of the book, you've been on tour, talking to young people, and all kinds of folks, I think, around
Mhm.
about the ideas in the book and the idea of, sparking the next generation to be interested in getting into politics. How has that gone for you?
It's gone well. As you mentioned, I tried to target youth, young Canadians. So I visited a number of schools and universities. We also had a great discussion piece sponsored by the Young Diplomats of Canada and the Young Politicians of Canada. And I was glad to talk to youngsters as well as to the not so young, like in my age crowd. But I particularly was gratified to listen to young people and how talking about public life and the elements that go into running and the reality of being an elected official. It wasn't a put off. In other words, they welcomed it. They were actually grateful that someone is talking, not only me, but people are talking about bringing in more young Canadians, about getting them engaged in the life of Canada, and a number of them are up to it. So that was fascinating for me because that was the whole issue with me putting pen to paper, is to begin that dialogue, and for those who are interested, to look at the experiences and the lessons that are contained in the book. So I had a very good time on tour, and now I'm concentrating rather than in person, although we have one of those in the coming days in Ottawa, is to do podcasts like yours, to talk to people through you, which I think is very time effective. So far, so good.
Excellent. That's great to hear. And I've enjoyed the book myself, and looking forward to getting into this topic with you today, Sergio. And I'm sure, the people that you spoke to felt, supported and validated in their aspirations as well. Someone with your experience must have been, great for them to speak to. So kudos to you, and congratulations on the success of your book so far.
Thank you so much, Amy. You're very kind.
Wonderful. So in January, you published an article called "Time to Revive the Team Canada Trade Missions," and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that to start with, and why you wrote that article.
The original Team Canada trade mission was established by Jean Chrétien, and he did it consistently throughout his 10-year mandate that he had from Canadians. And it was a real successful vehicle because it consisted of the Prime Minister, the Federal Trade Minister, all the premiers and territorial leaders, and three to 400 business leaders, which then got expanded to cultural leaders, educational leaders, so that we were promoting not just goods and services, but we were promoting who we are as Canadians and what we do well, and the kind of collaboration that we could entrust with multiple countries. And it was an eye opener because very few countries, if any, put on the same plane all their senior political leaders and all their senior captains of industry. Some people were talking about a risk. What happens if we put all these bodies and minds in a single aircraft and then something happens? But thank the Lord, nothing did. And so when you show up with 400 business leaders and all your senior political representatives, what it does is, first of all, it creates a great splash. It creates a buzz. And Canada typically doesn't make much news except when it's negative, like most news. Um, and so this was a real wow moment, which was very impressive to our host. And the second thing is that because of the senior level of the delegation, political and business as well, later cultural, educational, we were able to unlock a lot of doors that had been shut for some time. And what happened is that the host reciprocated. So we put before our business leaders their most senior business leaders and their most senior ministers and mandarins. So in the case of China, it was incredible, the senior mandarins and politicians that showed up, because the president of China or the premier of China was in attendance. And what we would do is seat strategically our business leaders with the kind of sectors and departments that they really needed to get through. So it was high level, it was first class, and I've been disappointed that while there have been different Team Canada missions, it's usually led by a minister and not nearly as many business leaders, except the case of Mexico a few weeks ago. I don't know why we don't go back to the Team Canada model as envisioned by Jean Chrétien, because if there was ever a need for that kind of tool today, this is it. When the trade is upside down, and when Carney is trying to move around the world as he's doing to create new relationships and renew old ones. And so I think Team Canada is made for the times. And I hope someone at the PMO listens to our interview one day when it comes out.
It'll come out soon, Sergio. No worries for that. And then so you think that it's given the current context, it's still, very relevant now and more relevant now than ever.
I'd say more relevant. And the other piece I didn't talk about, which is incredibly important to Carney, is relationships with the premiers.
Mhm.
And I've been impressed that in his first opening months as prime minister, he's had quite the number of meetings, most of them virtual, with the first ministers. And that plays into his big projects, big build. You need cooperation and collaboration from your provinces, and they welcome the attention of a prime minister. All of which to say, when we would go to a 2 or 3 countries over the 10 days of the Team Canada journey, Jean Chrétien used to say those were the 10 best days for federal provincial relations, because you have to imagine what it means, on the one hand, to show up in Ottawa or to do it virtually, and then everybody goes on their separate way. Whereas when you have a prime minister and premiers for 10 days, sharing the same planes, the same buses, the same hotels, doing lunches and dinners, participating in Team Canada events and mixing it up with the business leaders, it creates a real strong informal bond and allows the premiers, in a very positive atmosphere without sniping at each other, which happens domestically, to talk about business back home beyond trade, to talk about the irritants that the first ministers have to address. And so Jean Chrétien found it very effective over the 10 days to not only push trade for Canada, but push federal provincial relations to make Canada a better country.
Do you have a story that maybe you could tell us that would help us to understand even more, what it would be like or what it was like for you just being inside that mission? It sounds like it's like going away to camp almost, right? You've got all those informal conversations happening. Maybe there's a story you could tell to bring it home a little bit more.
Yeah, one story that resonates with me is we were on a Team Canada mission to China, and and one of the participants who owned a private plane said, "You need to meet the mayor of Dalian, a very industrial Chinese city." And his name was, or still is, Bo Xilai. And I said, "Well, we're pretty busy here going full out. I don't know if I can afford to do that." And he said, "Look, you won't regret it. He's an uprising, an up and coming star. He's going to go beyond the municipal level. And I think you should hook your wagon to his because it'll help Canada in terms of trade and commerce." And he's a very dapper guy, speaks English very well. So I was convinced. So what we did is we had a couple of hours very early the next morning. So we jumped on the plane, arranged the meeting with the mayor, met with the mayor, and that created a real lifelong relationship, which we took Canadian businesses to his city of Dalian, and with his blessing, again, opened a number of important doors. And this was just like a one off that ended up being a long term relationship. And long after my titles evaporated, I was no longer an ambassador, no longer a minister, no longer an MP, just an average Canadian citizen. Whenever I would be in China, I would look him up, and he then became the Minister of Commerce, like Minister of Trade. And then when the current president was elected, he was basically the runner-up. That's how good my Canadian friend had read him, and he rose to the highest positions in the land. But he was always willing to make time out of his very busy schedule to meet with me, and that was because we had become friends. And when you build a relationship, it lasts. It goes beyond your current job and your current title. So that one really resonates with me because I could have easily said no, but we kind of forced it into the agenda, and boy, did it ever pay off.
Amazing. And then when you think about kind of these giant trade missions, what kind of signal can it potentially send internationally as well about Canada and what Canada is doing?
Well, I think the signal that we sent, which we got from feedback, is first of all, they were very impressive. Who else puts together all of their senior, as I mentioned, politicians and business leaders? It also communicated that we were united, that we were organized, that we were ambitious, that we were adventurous. And I also think that when we then went beyond commerce and also brought cultural and educational leaders, that made it even more comprehensive and more impressive. The other thing, of course, is during those 10 days, you just don't meet with commercial ministers. I mean, the prime minister and premiers would meet with Zhu Rongji when he was premier of China. And then what happened is every alternating year, Jean Chrétien would visit China, and then the off year, the premier or the president would visit Canada. So those Team Canada visits also spawned a regularity of meetings between our leaders. And just to give you a contrast, during Justin Trudeau's time, it was very unfortunate because the relationship was in the deep freeze. And when Mr. Carney met with his counterpart, the president of China, it was the first time that those two leaders were in a room in over a decade.
Mhm.
And you just can't build a good relationship using that infrequency of meetings face to face and having the relationship be in the tank. Those Team Canada missions built, therefore, the trust between the political actors. They made time to discuss political issues and irritants between China and Canada. And the thing that went also very noticed by the Chinese is that we didn't talk about irritants publicly. In other words, we chose not to put China on the spot because no one wants to be embarrassed, least of all the Chinese, who very, very much respect saving face. And so behind closed doors, Mr. Kretchen and the premiers would talk very openly. And the Chinese expected that from a democratic country like ours, and they responded in kind. And so when Mr. Kretchen or the premiers would touch some hot buttons, it would be done in a respectful, in a positive tone. But what happened is the president or the premier of China, every once in a while after Mr. Kretchen spoke, would actually turn to one of officials and say, I hope you got that because I'd like to have a report on that Canadian who's in prison for whatever. In other words, they heard the message. Because if you try to stick handle them publicly, then you won't get to first base with the Chinese. And you will actually make your issues harder to achieve, especially when it comes to Canadians who may be unlawfully kept in China. If you kind of puck them in public, they will be hard to move. Whereas if you show respect, then they will respond in kind. And that was a very important lesson. And in fact, I noticed that Mr. Carney commented on that after he met with the Chinese president. He said one of the things that was interesting was if you've got something to tell me, tell me. Don't go to the media, don't go off base. Just ring me up and let's deal that way, which is the way we did business 20, 30 years ago.
Hmm. Is there anything that helps to accelerate the understanding of these cultural nuances that are so important when dealing with any other country?
I think it starts the understanding first must have trust. I find that trust is probably as good an indispensable commodity in public life as any other characteristic. Because if you don't have trust between counterparts, you have very little. It's not real, it's not tangible, and it's not sustainable. But if you build the time and make the investments, it wasn't easy for Jean Chrétien to visit China every second year and for their leaders to visit us in the off year, because it's still a big world full of different places and people to see. But I think trust was impeccably important. And I saw that firsthand between Jean and his counterpart, the premier or the president. They became quite familiar with one another. And when you would see the Chinese make jokes or funny stories, you knew that there was a comfort zone, that they weren't brittle or that they weren't stone faced. It was a comfortable relationship that I think uh, produced real dividends for both countries. So I'm very pleased that Carney has been able to reset that relationship. Now, the Chinese aren't easy. Their system is not like ours. And sometimes they say and do things that we don't share. But as Carney famously says, that's part of the world as it is, right? And we need to deal with that. That doesn't mean we sell our soul. But I think if you build a trust, you can move files both ways.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit more broadly about, other kind of gatherings that you had and your famous soccer story. So if you could tell us the soccer story for those of us who haven't heard it yet, please.
Yeah, the soccer story became the best form of diplomacy for me for almost 4 to 5 years because I started that game on my second year while I was in Geneva. And again, it came completely by accident rather than by design. Honestly speaking, we were at the house of the Singapore ambassador. And at one point, someone said, look, we're eating far too much and exercising too little. We're all getting bigger in the wrong places. So we need to figure out what to do. And so some people spoke up, and I, when it was my turn, I said, "Listen, I've got a big property at the Canadian residence. There was almost 15 acres, and there was one place of just green grass that all we did is cut it, even though we had beautiful trees elsewhere." And so I said, "I've got a beautiful property. Why don't we play a game of soccer? If you guys want, I'll invite you, and we'll see how that goes." And it caught the attention of the group, and they said, "Fine." So I invited about 25 ambassadors to play soccer on a Saturday morning, and we played, and then we had some drinks, and then we had a barbecue outside. I had chairs outside, and then we would have the most honest conversation about trade. And with each game, because then I invited them back each month for about 8 months of the year, and then the other 4 months were kind of too cold, not Canadian cold, but Swiss cold. Um, and with each passing game, the discussions got richer and the discussions got deeper. And what happened is there was a real depth of trust that was building every month we played between the players. They were the same players. I actually got criticized because I didn't invite new people or more people, but I said, listen, I can't play. We can't play soccer with 50 people, nor can we have a coherent discussion with a lecture hall. So I kept it at the original 25, and it worked like a charm. And then we had maintenance workers who built us nets with leftover lumber, bought the mesh, painted lines. It became a professional league. The only thing that wasn't professional was us ambassadors trying to play soccer. Some good, some not so good, but it ran for 4 years, Amy. Incredibly productive. Members would never cross each other in the council meeting because of that bond. And then I convinced my successor that this was a great idea, and he did it for 4 years. Then when he left, he convinced his successor to keep playing, and they did that for 4 years. And then we tried to convince the newest one, and he wasn't into soccer, so it died. But it was 12 years of playing soccer, but soccer was the vehicle by which we were able to speak to one another. And we became so chummy that we didn't speak as Sergio Marchi, the ambassador of Canada. When I spoke as a friend of the WTO. I said what I felt. I said, here are the positives, here are the negatives, here I think is what we should do. And it wasn't purely from a Canadian strategic vantage point, but it was one of strengthening this multilateral institution, which today is in deep trouble for a number of different reasons.
Mhm. Yeah, I certainly see and that's incredible. The sustained, interaction for 4 years and the ability to use that as an example, that's something that people should continue, doing. I'm wondering also about, I understand the idea of keeping it kind of closed to a certain number of players. I mean, in any kind of team dynamic, you can only have so many people, engaged in something. What would you say to other groups who might have felt excluded? Would you say that use this as an example, build your own kind of soccer game kind of thing? There's nothing wrong with having something or doing something different in order to build that cohesion in other ways, as well. Is
Exactly.
that what you would say?
E-
Yeah.
Exactly. And what I said is, listen, I apologize in a way, but we can't play with more than 25 people. And if I always change them, it's not going to build the kind of trust in a core group. And the core group was not just developed countries, the core group was intentionally thought out because we had developed countries, we had developing countries, and we had least developed country ambassadors. So it was a good club of 25, which is what the WTO Director General would do when he would put people in a room. He put about 20, 25 people that represented the 150 members that were there at the time of my ambassadorship. And what we would do is, if in that room of 25 we had found consensus, or if in our group around the soccer lunch found consensus, then each of us would go out and touch base with another 25.
Hmm.
And that's how you built larger and larger concentric circles. So I kind of defended not to be exclusive, but to build with a critical mass representative of the WTO family at large, and see if we can uh, forward some of these issues and some of these consensus. And then I would say, just as you said, I said it stops no one from doing their own thing. In fact, during the winter months, I then started a cigar club of all things at a bar called the Library. And I said, well, that sounds pretty good. If we put the library in our agendas, it's not a bad thing to be at the library. And so what I did is I provided the cigars, and it was the same thing, 20, 25 people or less, because not everybody likes smoking cigars. But cigars and a drink became the conduit for a discussion. And then, lo and behold, the Chinese stole our intellectual property on this because he saw the value of both these cigar nights and these soccer games, that he created a ping pong fraternity. So he had in his basement of the embassy two professional ping pong tables with scoreboards and nameplates. And what he did is he organized regular ping pong matches, followed by a Chinese luncheon over, again, an honest discussion. And so the soccer not only did its thing, but it broadened other initiatives. It created the seeds for which, I then did a cigar club, and then the Chinese did ping pong. To your listeners, it might seem as childish, but if it's seen as a conduit for having an effective, candid, valuable discussion, I would put those discussions up to any that we've had in any auditorium or in any configuration at the WTO. I really would. And I bet you that 9 out of 10 people who attended those games and activities would say the same thing.
For sure, for sure. And I think that, recently I was talking at my company, we were talking about how to get, people together in unconventional ways. And we are talking about the idea of having spa days or spa weekends for some of the folks there who are interested in that. So
Yeah.
why not? Do you think that like a healthy ecosystem has, many groups who are meeting informally to have real conversations?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. In Geneva, the job of the ambassador, when you wake up every morning, you're constantly in different configurations of meetings.
Mhm.
And the sole reason is because you're trying to find consensus. We don't vote at the WTO. We have the provisions for a vote, but it's never been utilized because it is believed that if you vote on things, it will fracture the membership. So let's say today you and I are a team on agriculture, and we vote the same way, but tomorrow on industrial tariffs, you have a different position. So it is the objective that decision making is made entirely on consensus. And when you had a membership of 150, you can't possibly find consensus on the first go in a room of 150 people. That doesn't work at the WTO. It doesn't work at corporations in Canada. That's why they have executive meetings. That's why they have cabinet ministers. You can't decide with a caucus of 150. No, you got to break up the caucus into the executive. And that's the same thing at the WTO. So you were forever meeting in the morning over meals, breakfast, lunches, and dinners. Uh, and then when you found consensus, you would have a totally different mix of people to try to convince them. And that's how you build consensus. And the smaller, the better, as you build up to the big. And that's why it takes a lot of time. That's why decision making is a lot slower at the international level, because there's many countries, many views, and you have to listen to everyone because everyone walks around in Geneva with a veto in their back pocket.
Mhm.
If a member says no, and if that member is big enough, the train gets halted, and so it pays to talk. It pays to build bridges between one another, and that's what the job largely consisted of, as well as negotiating from your own country's national interests. But I had to get used to that because I went from being a minister where you're going 100 kilometers an hour landing in Geneva and the car is not moving more than 20, 25 miles an hour because things are slower, or because everyone has a veto, you move as fast as the slowest member is willing to go. So I found it a little frustrating to have decisions take that long. And then I kind of learned the patience that is required for international diplomacy. There's no other way. It takes time. You literally build it one member at a time.
Interesting. Thanks for helping us understand those dynamics. And so that is kind of the external view of building kind of that trust. I wonder if we could take an example now of more internally looking at that with the example of how you used to have like lunches and meals for your volunteers of your own team, for instance, and how you felt that that was very important. Tell us a little bit about that and what kind of outcomes you had.
Yeah, in politics, again, volunteers are indispensable because you could be the most capable person in the world, you could be the smartest person in the world. You can't do politics at any level on your own. Politics is a team sport, not only a team in terms of colleagues when you were at North York Council, federal councillors, as an MP, obviously federal members of parliament on in your party and in the opposition, and then when you got to Geneva, all your ambassadorial counterpart. It takes a team, and in politics, you can't pay everyone in a campaign because a you wouldn't have the dollars to spread around, and secondly you would go over the spending limit, and if you did and you had won you would forfeit your seat. So volunteers were essential, and I always said to our executive of the Liberal Association, when they would ask me, why are we spending so much on free activities for our volunteers, why don't we have a cash bar for our volunteers, I would say don't look at it as an expense. Look at it as an investment in people. Why would we not give people a free beer and a free glass of wine if they've helped us during the campaign at the victory party? I never had a cash bar because I thought that was highly disrespectful for the volunteers that were congregating that. In the campaign office, we struck a deal with the Italian banquet facilities, which were plentiful in my riding. We said, look, rather than giving us a financial contribution, why don't you commit to providing us food once a week? And we did that with a number of different banquet facilities, which means we had hot and cold food brought in every single day. I'm food obsessed because I'm an Italian Canadian. But I felt in an old-fashioned way, if people are coming to the office, they also deserve to have a bite and have a drink while they're giving of themselves. We would have annual Christmas parties. We would have annual chestnut roasts for our volunteers. And for me, it was always an investment because the more the volunteers felt at home, the more they were loyal to you and to the party. And we had a very, very strong and healthy association. And I said, if we're going to spend it on our volunteers, then we'll fundraise it. Or we would never send representatives of our York West Liberal Association to a national policy session in Calgary without paying their way, or without paying their hotel, or without paying their meals. Um, and in criticism of that, because it did cost a penny or two, I would always say, look, they are going for us. They're not going on their own time for pleasure. They are our ambassadors. And so if they go, we need to completely underwrite it so that they know we appreciate their representation. And that's what we did. And we never looked back.
Very good. I think that there are a lot of, takeaways here for, people who have teams. And even if they're, whether they're in the nonprofit sector or in the commercial sector, there's a lot there. I used to work at a number of startups, and at one of the startups, the startup with the best culture, one of the things that they did was that the executives on every 2 weeks or once a month, they would make lunch for all the employees, and, like, they would do,
Well,
like, a
okay.
barbecue, and then everyone would eat together, or they would make food at home and bring it in. It was a small enough company that could be done,
Yeah, yeah.
and it was just one of the elements of such a wonderful kind of culture, for them, and it did wonders for the company, I think, and for that bonding between the teams and the executives.
Yeah, yeah, and the other thing in politics is, you create a lot of new volunteers at election time, because elections for volunteers at whatever level is the pinnacle of their civic activities, and they would see it as their civic obligations, which was very impressive because the number of volunteers that work in political parties and in campaigns, they really do a yeoman's job for democracy if you think about it. But the fact that we would have activities for them ensured that you wouldn't see the volunteers just at election time, when sometimes people are cynical. Oh, you're just calling me now. The last time you called me was 4 years ago. Well, with us, we created that FaceTime quite regularly. And in addition to boosting the loyalty and appreciation of our volunteers, it also grounded me, because I would be meeting with hundreds of volunteers at different events at different times of the year. And I would ask them, so what do you think of the government? What do you think of this policy? Or they would tell me without being asked. So it became another opportunity for me to stay grounded, to stay informed, so that I can go back to Ottawa with that new intelligence, if you will, in terms of what our government should be doing. So volunteers are central, and if you replenish the coffers by investing in them, they will make you look good.
Excellent. 2 different kind of framings of that idea of building trust and bringing people together. I'd love to go back to, the diplomacy side of things for a moment and just, ask you, what happens, how much of that work is really happening outside of the formal negotiating rooms? If you were to give us kind of a sense of, proportion.
Yeah, the most important configuration in Geneva is the informal meetings. And there's a myriad of different concoctions and different groups that have met over the years. So let's say, there's formations for developing countries in the G7, or developed countries generally, or agricultural nations. So there's so many different organizations, but it's in the informal sessions of those groups and of the regular committees, because when you have an informal session, the minutes are not taken, and therefore there is no document of who said what, when, and where, which is the formal meeting. So when you go to a formal meeting, everybody clocks in. When you speak, it's on the record. Then it's produced like a Hansard in the House of Commons, and everybody sees it. Goes back to the capitals, and that's an important element in the equation of the overall negotiations. But it's in the informal sessions that you get most of the truth, most of the problems, most of the challenges, most of the jealousies, because it all comes out, because it doesn't cost anybody, except if you're unrealistic and not personable, it'll affect you in an individual way. But from a substantive way, it hurts no one. And so that's where it all comes out. And as it comes out, you work at it so that you build the bridges, tear down the walls, to the point, Amy, that you can then turn the meeting into a formal meeting and pick up where you left off in the informal. So, if you will, the negotiations in the formal sense are the main course, but it's how you build the appetizers that will dictate whether you like the dinner or not. So informal meetings will set up all your formal meetings, and then those formal committee meetings will send it to the general council. And sometimes the general council, which is the supreme decision making body where everybody gets to meet, and we did it regularly every 2 weeks, we would usually start in an informal session just to make sure there's no flies in the ointment. And if they are, to be able to deal with them and head them off in an informal session before gaveling the formal. That's what I always did when I was chairman. I would typically start in an informal session and I would say, look, we have a report from the services. How are people feeling about it? Are there any issues or problems that we should know about? And you would get some flags of different countries going up, and sometimes you would have to require more time and you never get to the formal side because the informal meeting tends to be more complicated than we thought. Or if there's general satisfaction and agreement, you don't spend too much time in informal and you gavel the formal. So it's always a back and forth. It's not new that when you go from one to the other that you don't go back to the other when you have a problem. And that's all driven by consensus. If it wasn't by consensus, we wouldn't spend as much time as we did in the informal sessions because we would say, well, we don't have everybody, but I think we got the votes. That doesn't happen. So you have to really work at the informal if you want a formal meeting gavelled in the right approved way that can then go to council, because if it's not approved, it can't go to council.
It reminds me of boardroom dynamics and having a,
Yeah,
a good board
yeah,
chair. Okay, so it's
yeah.
similar, I guess. And then so your informal meetings wouldn't always have all the same people as the formal meetings, right? Depending on who you wanted to talk to, correct?
Exactly. Every issue, Amy, had a different configuration. So when the director general of the WTO would call what I described in the book a green room meeting, the green room came many years ago when the boardroom of the director general was green, and he would invite 25 meetings. It became known as the green room, and he'd pick very carefully a representative group, and it would be informal. It would never be formal so as to create discussion. And the director general also discouraged ambassadors to give speeches from text. So, first of all, usually it was only ambassador. You didn't have backup, so you were on the line, right? Secondly, you weren't expected to make a speech. Rather than a speech, let's get specific. Let's say what you want to say. Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you disagree, why? If you disagree, do you have an answer? Do you have a proposal for the rest? So it's very, very conducive to talking real talk without being a bureaucrat and without having people kind of whisper words in your ear. It's pretty raw, and what we found is if an issue flew among the very diversified 25, it had a great chance to land in council, because once we had an agreement around one issue on agriculture or on industrial products, then the 25 would go out and reach another 25 and so on. So the green room was very, very effective because, again, you can't negotiate in a body of 150 and expect to get an agreement anytime soon.
Hmm. I wonder as a takeaway for, our listeners, do you get kind of a spidey sense when you know that an informal discussion is needed, or more kind of informal activities like soccer games are needed? How do you recognize that people need to maybe come together in a way that is not happening, right now, to have some important discussions?
Yeah, the soccer came by accident, but then it became a necessity. There would be many times when people would say, okay, the next time we play soccer and we have our lunch discussion, let's put this on the agenda, or let's have Peter speak to this issue. In other words, not that it was choreographed, but because people recognize how important and how honest the discussion that was, people would telegraph in advance to say, Sergio, I hope we can discuss this issue because I think it would be really timely. Or 2 weeks after that game, we're having a meeting at the Services Council. So you had a sense of which issues to play. And I was chairman of the services agenda. I was chairman of the general council. I was also chairman of the Ukrainian accession working party. And when something is tough, that you require the informality to break down the tensions. Because if something is brittle and you go into a formal meeting, you run the real risk of breakage, of rupture. And then to put Humpty Dumpty back together again takes twice as much time. So a good chairman will have a good nose on when to go to informal in order to engender a more free flowing discussion in the hopes that what is said by successive ambassadors, there's going to be one or two uh, pieces that are really going to help us, and then you can put the machine back in formal. But whenever it was tough, I would never go to a formal meeting. It was just too brittle, too much of a risk, too much of a um, um, playing poker with people's issues and interests. So informal first, exhaust informal. Don't worry if you never get to the formal, because by the time you do, you'll be better for it.
Hmm. And so it sounds like sometimes there are signals from people, the people around you, when they're asking questions or asking to discuss things, and then sometimes it's recognizing that an issue is sensitive, or there's tension around it as a leader, and just understanding that and having empathy, for that in the situation.
Or sometimes a chairman knows which member is positive on one thing, or which member is negative, or which members are very, very important, let's say, to agriculture. So, for example, Brazil, which is still a developing country, but when you look at just the agricultural sector, it's really a superpower by what they produce. So if we're in a very sensitive, important discussion around agriculture, and the ambassador of Brazil had not taken the floor, then I would kind of go to the offense and say, may I ask the Brazilian delegation if they have any views on the current issue before us? So what you do is you almost force the relevant players to speak, because they're relevant in terms of the interest. And then they're also relevant because whatever Brazil says has an impact on the friends of Brazil or other like minded countries. So sometimes you have to go on the offense and bring out the members who would really speak to this issue in profound ways. And that helped push the file forward, because when you have a relevant country, an important country who is silent, then you know that something is amiss.
Right. Yes, that's wise and something grounded in experience. Sergio, thanks for sharing that with us. I think these are. Did you learn all this through experience, or is it something that you kind of have a knack for?
I think I kind of like to talk. Sometimes I talk too much. I like to socialize, so I don't mind having invited people for soccer, for cigars, or what have you. But I think a lot of what I did at the WTO, you learn from experience. I didn't go there with premeditated designs, except knowing what our issues are, knowing what our interests are, knowing what our vulnerabilities are. You got to have that sort of knowledge. You can't get into any meeting if you don't know how the issues will impact Canada one way or another. That's first and foremost. But the different designs on diplomacy and how to bring people together, or when I was chairman of the general council, you would have to make yourself available to all sorts of ambassadors who ask for your time. And in fact, if you do it properly for the year, because the chairmanship rotated annually and between developed and developing countries, but for that one year, I spent more time on my general council chair obligations that I did as an ambassador to Canada. And for that, I had my deputy ambassador really play a bigger role, because when 150 people get up in the morning, you're always bound to have some people get up on the wrong side of the bed and they call their chairman. So it's a big job. It's a taxing job. If you do it right, it can allow the WTO to move forward.
Okay. Um, Looking at our context today as a society and as a nation trying to do things in the world, do you think that anything has changed with respect to the relevance of bringing people together? Like, is that an art that we may have put aside for a while and that we now need to pick up again, or is it something that we just need to push harder on? Inviting you to comment on the relevance?
I'd say the latter. It's sometimes we may forget to do that, or some people in the last 10, 15 years have suggested that we have sat on our laurels internationally too much, that our words are more profound than our actions. And I think there is some truth to that, and we need to pay attention to that. Because if we are not walking the talk, then our talk is not going to be as effective for other countries. You need to show them, right? And so I think it's like riding a bike, bringing people together. If you haven't done it for a while, you know how to do it when you get in the mood. But I think when you deal with consensus based organizations, you don't have a choice. You don't have an option but to engage, but to talk about bringing people together. I think the era of Trump has even made it more important, and this is something that Carney struck a chord when he spoke at the World Economic Forum, where he says quite rightly that the old world with the United States is no longer. We still will have a rapport, but we need to really build our non-US relationships. And that's what he's been concentrating. He's been traveling far and wide, came back from a trip last week. He's off to Norway and the UK this week. So bringing people together and backing each other publicly, not just privately, because when Trump first came along and he beat up on a country, very few other countries would say anything because they feared that they would be next with this bully. And that's a natural progression. But ultimately, we need to talk publicly to backstop one another. Otherwise, he can pick us off one at a time. So, the ability to bring people together with this troubled world and with a Trump mentality that the Wild West is the way he wants to go makes multilateralism and bilateral and plurilateral get-togethers much more important. And without it, you're going to get bruised.
And so we've all been in rooms where people have come together, and then maybe we've walked away wondering whether or not we accomplished anything, right? So, in your opinion, what makes a gathering like truly effective rather than just performative?
And sometimes you don't even have to organize a gathering. I mean, look at the experience now where Trump has bullied us on the whole issue of the trade tariffs, which are illegal, with his talk about the 51st state, which bugs every Canadian. Um, these 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 times necessitate those get-togethers, but it sometimes the best effectiveness comes in unorganized way. Look at the number of Canadians, pardon me, that are not flying to the United States anymore, that are foregoing their annual trips to Florida and going to Europe instead. Look at the number of Canadians unorganized who are not shopping for American products. Look at the number of Canadian businessmen that are now willing to follow Carney to build non US relationships. In other ways, no one is really organizing the consumers, but the consumers have organized
Mhm.
themselves, right? And so sometimes the best organizations or organized events are the ones that happen naturally, organically, without anyone being the conductor. And that's powerful because I think the numbers on people not going to America are in the double digits, and it's having a monetary impact on the neighboring states, particularly. But um, the most effective meetings when you do come to organize is to have the right members in the room when you're looking at a multilateral.
Mhm.
If you only have developed countries, well, that's one third of the WTO. What do you do with the rest?
Mhm.
If you do only developing countries, you can't move it without America and the European Union. So multilaterally, the membership is key. Who do you have around the room that is important and reflective of the bigger body? What is the agenda? Make it laser focused. Don't waste time on small issues that don't matter. Uh, thirdly, build a head of steam. So I would never start with the hardest issue. Some people do, but I would build incrementally. I would build some positive achievements, build some momentum, and then tackle the bigger ones with some wind behind your back. And then you've got to persevere, and knowing that a meeting can be ineffective and the meeting can result in a no. But you know what? You can't give up as much as you would want to sometimes. The next morning, you start again, because if my mousetrap didn't work, what other mousetraps are out there?
Mhm. And then earlier, you alluded to when sometimes issues are, overly brittle or people haven't discussed them enough ahead of time. Then, maybe it's better to put off the meeting. So, would you say that there are times when the risks might outweigh the benefits in terms of having that
Uh,
gathering, prematurely?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Timing, they say in politics, is everything, right? And in diplomacy, it does matter. The chairman controls the calling of the meeting generally, obviously with some backup support, but by and large, the chairman has convening power. But if I think an international issue has broken the wrong way, or if there's something in the media that might cause a huge amount of friction between some competing players, I'll delay the meeting. I think you don't want to call a meeting just because, or you don't want to call a meeting because you want to move quickly. It's important to move right and correct, which sometimes means going slower than you had anticipated, and paying attention to the village,
Mhm.
right? Paying attention to how the village elders are reacting to certain issues. And if they're too hot, let those desires cool down before convening. Or the thing I also would do is, rather than convening one meeting at a brittle time, I would bring one member in, or two or three at a time. So small little group sessions, talk through it. And then from each meeting, there's a new branch that you grasp, and then you offer that branch to the next group of two or three. So that's the other option. Don't bring the whole 150 together, but see how you can make some headway during some turbulent weather by having fewer people around the table.
So, some people would say that it's institutions that drive change, and then others might say that it's more about the relationships between people. In your experience, which matters more?
I'd say relationships. I
Mhm.
mean, obviously, it takes two to dance. I'm fond of saying you need both plumbing and poetry in this
Mhm.
business of public life. You need to deal with the practical, and then you need to deal with the vision, and that's the plumbing and that's the poetry. You can't just have one or the other. You need both. Um, and sometimes, you know, I feel that the nature of the relationships, the trust in the relationships, the leadership ability of a chairman makes all the difference in the world. The institution doesn't negotiate, it's the members in the institution that negotiate. The institution gives the member the rules, the standards, the compass, absolutely, the history, the pride of a good organization like the WTO. Ever since the Second World War, it was hugely influential for developing a global economy that works for more people than just the rich. And in the last 10 years, it's ground to a halt. So the institution is hurting. But the reason it's hurting is because there's no political will between the players. There's not enough trust between America and the Chinese, or America and even Europe. America always was the locomotive in the WTO and many UN institutions. They, as the locomotive, pulled the train forward, sometimes in ways that weren't agreed to completely by other members, but were a locomotive nonetheless. Today, Trump is the caboose, which means he's slowing down things. He's dragging things to a halt. So I'd have to lean on the side of, when the relationships are working, when they're healthy, the institution is humming. When the relationships break down, then the relevancy of the institution is immediately at risk. And we're seeing that in real tangible ways at the WTO these days.
Thank you for that. All right, my last question for you today, Sergio. You've shared so many lessons through your books and through speaking with people. If there was one lesson that people could take away today about how to build trust, what would you say?
It's a great question. I mean, there's many different recipes for trust and for public leadership, for example, and none of them are wrong, right? Because we offer them through experience. But in terms of building trust, if I'm pushed to pick one single issue, it's the ability to be a good listener, to use your ears rather than your mouth when you're meeting with someone. Have that person bring out what is deep in their souls. Use empathy and be empathetic to other people's views. Live and learn how it feels to have your feet in their shoes. You can't do any of that without the ability of listening. And then once you have the ability of listening, is you must have the ability, if validated, to change your views based on what you listen. Because if you just listen to a person and do nothing, you haven't heard anything. But if you listen and learn and move, then you're building the blocks for success. So I'd have to say, be a good listener, use emotional intelligence as much as you can. It's probably more important than raw intelligence in public life, and be capable of being flexible to your own views.
Thank you for that, Sergio. It's a wonderful lesson applicable in every room. So
I would hope so.
thank you for that. It's been
My
wonderful,
pleasure.
wonderful to have you on the show again, Sergio, to share, with us and things that we can think about across, many different sectors and many different rooms, and across many different relationships that we may all be building and working on, and that we're building and working on as a nation as well. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Well, thank you to you. It's such a treat being on your podcast. You bring out hopefully the best in people, and as well as the honesty of people's ideas. I feel very comfortable with you, and therefore I enjoy our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. And for everyone who's listening, I encourage you to subscribe and support Wired for Change, and think about, how we can change as a society and what we need to know about and explore and share with others. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Wired for Change.